I found it on Rhema Radio.
Hi, I'm Pastor Victor Lee from Bible College of Malaysia. I want to challenge you to sign a course with us. We have different modules today. We have short-term courses where we finish within 1 week. And then we have night classes for those of you who can't come for the day class. And we have different extension centers around Malaysia. So our program covers from Certificate of Biblical Studies to a Master of Divinity. So there are different levels for everyone. I'm sure there's something for you. It is our purpose to equip the saints for the harvest that is to come. So I want to encourage you, log on to our website www.bcm.org.my where you get all the information, sign up a course today. So you don't need to wait for intake. We have intake every trimester. So just feel free and log on and then call us and sign up with us.
Hi, this is Heidi from Refuge for the Refugees. We're always in need of volunteers, so if you're free on Monday to Fridays from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m, come join us and volunteer with us. If you're keen to volunteer with us, write in to us at refugefortherefugees@gmail.com.
Hi friends, this week's midweek service sermon was from Kenneth Chen at X Church, entitled Be an Example. Look out for that. And now for this week's interview.
Hi guys, you're listening to Rhema Radio, the weekly podcast on faith, culture, music, and more. I'm Victor, and I'll be your host for today. I'm very honored to have in the studio with me a very distinguished guest, some might even say a very learned individual, Dr. Ron Choong. Dr. Ron Choong is the director and founder of Academy for Christian Thought that is based in New York. Over a span of 13 years, he has accumulated 4 degrees from London, Princeton and Yale in areas as diverse as theology, science and archaeology. He's published many books and articles, and he teaches in seminaries and universities. But at the heart of it, he is a humble PJ boy who was educated in LaSalle PJ. He's also a disciple of John Stott, who you may know in 2005, Time magazine named as one of the most influential people in our world. Now, welcome, Dr. Ron. How are you?
Fine, thank you very much.
I am so happy to be able to talk to you today about things that have occupied most of your life.
Indeed, yes.
Indeed. And we want to talk to you about that, specifically about your ministry with the Academy for Christian Thoughts, which acronym is ACT.
ACT.
Can you tell us a little bit more, Doctor, about this ministry?
Well, I went to London to read law and practice for a bit from Lincoln's Inn. And then I met this retired pastor at the time, Dr. John Stott. And he had a habit of going to 3 principal universities, Cambridge, Oxford, and London, to look for single young men to encourage them to give their mind to the Lord, to do ministry. And of course, I think I was the first or probably the only non-British that he approached on this. I then worked for the church among the homeless ministries and the mercy ministries of reaching to older people. And I had the opportunity to have lunch with the entire church staff every Monday for about 3 years. So I got to know him a lot. Over the years, he encouraged me to go into full-time ministry, not as a pastor, but as someone bridging the gap between the academy and the church. And he suggested New York City of all places, some place that I didn't want to go because in the late 80s, it wasn't a very pleasant place to be in. I was single at the time, so I thought, well, I'll give it a year or two, get it out of my system, no more guilt, and then I'll go back to legal practice. I went to New York, and Uncle John was my first financial sponsor, surprisingly. And I'll have to say, he wrote a £600 check of his personal funds, not church funds, to make the case that he is behind it. He gave me a book he wrote in 1965 called Your Mind Matters. And in the book, as well as in subsequent conversations, he sort of felt sad about the fact that the church is growing, but we have a very superficial Christianity. And I said, what does that mean? And he says, we rarely think through our beliefs. And he admitted it was the case for him as well, because he grew up in the Christian world, just as I did, third generation Christian. We had no other ways to even question what is it we believe in and why. So that was the genesis of the ministry. And when I started ACT, I was very adamant to have the 3 terms mean something. Number 1, I'm unashamedly Christian in a very secular world in New York City. So the word C, Christian, has to be in it. The word academy, partly because I was highly influenced by Plato's thought, that Plato, a lot of his writings and his work, so shaped St. Augustine and therefore shaped Christian theology that I wanted to sort of pay homage to the fact that the academy is about learning, about investigating, and letting the facts fall where they fall. And finally, Thought, Academy for Christian Thought. I wanted to make sure the ministry is not one of propagating previous information without examining it, but to be like Socrates, to examine the life, the thought. So ACT. Now, do I say Academy of Christian Thought? I said, no, it's for. Because when you use the word of Christian thought, you're assuming there is already a fixed Christian thought that cannot be changed and is permanently there. I realized that's not true. I wanted to be Academy for Christian Thought, so that this academy is to help Christians think through as we engage new developments, new scientific discoveries, new ways of living, new ways of understanding. So that's the genesis of ACT as a ministry. And in terms of what we do three things. Number one, research. Number two, education. And number three, publication. The research work is where I do a lot of archaeological work, field expeditions when I travel to different places to research the history of Christianity, the history of beliefs, history of faith, and even history of humanity. I do a lot of paleoanthropological work where I follow people who have discovered fossils and bones who are still alive, people like Don Johanson, people like Ian Tattersall, to understand how they interpret the things they find from the ground, because most of them are not what we would call Christian believers. So I want to see whether my belief can survive the test of scrutiny from their perspective as well. And in terms of education, we do online courses, we do live courses in New York City, and our target audience tend to be people in the 40s and 50s. Now, why that age group? This demographic tends to be people who have been Christians for a long time, and they figured out, as I approached at the peak of my career or end of my career, I asked different questions that I would ask as a 20-year-old. And they wanted someone like me who has no strings to any denominational interests or academy or any funding process, so that I can be fully independent. And they know from experience, reading all I've written in the past 30 years, I'm willing to say I was wrong. I'm willing to say I do not know the answer. I'm okay with that. So they just wanted a straight shooter. And to our surprise, we have people supporting the ministry who are not even Christians, including famously a Buddhist in Singapore. And the reason she supports the ministry is because she just wanted to know what is true. And she was surprised that as a Christian, I took Buddhism very seriously. And I wanted to know why Buddhism was what it was. As I mentioned to you in the car, my impression is that if the Lord Buddha met Jesus, there would not be a Buddhism, because they were looking for the same existential questions that was asked 500 years before Jesus was born. Now, finally, the third prong of our ministry is publication. It's my ardent hope that I can leave a legacy of writings, not so much for academic purposes, but writings designed for the layperson who's curious. So going forward, all my books will be hopefully under 100 pages long. As they say, the best book is the ones that are actually being read.
That's true.
There we go.
And your students, I take it then, based on what you just shared, come from all walks of life and different faiths?
Most of them are Christians. Many of them are lapsed churchgoers. Now, what does that mean, right? They still regard themselves as followers of Jesus, but many of them are disappointed, at least in America, with a lot of the scandals, financial scandals mostly, sexual scandals sometimes, and sometimes the backbiting and the infighting within traditions of the church, that they begin to ask questions. And this is a 21st century phenomenon, by the way. When I was growing up in the 70s, we had no access to anything called the internet or Wikipedia or Google. So there was no way for us to check anything. If someone says something, whether it's a preacher or a speaker or in politics and the charama, there's no way to check. Today, they have access galore. You can be checked as you preach. The new generation demand more accountability than my generation ever dared to hope for. And it's a good thing. So as they look for these accountability factors, my impression is this, and I tell a lot of my friends, if you as a church member do not faithfully and responsibly provide some kind of information about the questions they are asking, they will find it in National Geographic, in Scientific American, CNN, and those have no scrutiny. They're incentivized for viewership. the church should be incentivized for faithfulness to God's exploration of who we are and our response to God that we now call the Bible. So from that perspective alone, I advise most of my friends in ministry, don't repeat the mantra you learned when you were young. Listen to the voices of today's youth. Understand why they ask those questions. Do not slam them down or shut them down with authority, but sympathize with them because they're inundated with so much data that in my generation, we were protected from it. And they're puzzled. So we find, for example, every Easter, every Christmas time, at least on American TV, and I assume it trickles down here, you'll find all kinds of television shows portraying Jesus, portraying the Easter story. And in almost every case, it's a bit negative. In almost every case, the conclusion is left to suspicion rather than affirmation or disaffirmation. So my goal in a lot of my work is to say, well, fair enough, there are critics of the Christian story that may have legitimate questions. Now, my research is into, are their conclusions equally legitimate? And in many cases, they're not. In many cases, we're all driven by agendas and incentives. So part of my work is to say, which of the critiques that they pose are legitimate critiques that can be verified, they're tenable, which are not. So one example that some of the readers here in Malaysia may have come across is a now very world-famous New Testament scholar called Bart Ehrman. Now, Bart and I went to the same school, Princeton. We did our PhDs there. We studied pretty much with the same professor who was the world authority in New Testament. That professor died at the age of 99 as a fully committed believer. Bart Ehrman is a proclaimed agnostic. I'm a missionary. Why the difference? So we talk about this, right? And in engaging this, we begin to realize that so much of what we assume about theology are precisely that assumption. So our work to publish is to give a resource to the next generation.
I suppose in a nutshell, you're providing a platform for people to discover truths that they may not be necessarily exposed to in the context of their own Christian faith, because there's not much avenues for which they can get this kind of information. We're going to take a short break. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Rhema Radio.
Hello, I'm David Chin, the Artistic Director of the Malaysia and Hong Kong Bach Festival, and my life verse is Philippians 4:13. I can do all things to Christ who strengthens me.
Rhema Radio.
And we're back. You're listening to me, Victor, on Rhema Radio. I'm here in the studio talking to Dr. Ron Choong, and we are exploring this whole idea about people who come to his place to be able to seek answers to questions that they have about their faith. Now, you take a very interdisciplinary approach to your studies as well as to your teaching.
Yes.
How has that been for you? I mean, what was your motivation in taking this approach, which I must say is quite unique because many people just focus on or specialize in a specific area?
Well, I first explored the idea of university. And it seems to me the word university, as it's originally coined, refers to a unification of diversity of knowledge, to unify diverse knowledge. Today, partly because by the 17th century, there was so much to learn, they broke it up into tiny departments and they don't talk to each other very much because each department began to have assumptions of their own. And then it becomes a turf war. So today, I do not know of a single university in the world, and I've checked, who actually allow you to do research across disciplines. They do not do that for all kinds of reasons, some good, some not so good. So I began to explore this and I said the only way to do this is if I'm not beholden to funding of a university or a denomination for that matter. So the idea of interdisciplinary investigation was new, but I got to say it was terrifying to start with. Terrifying because I had no road plan. I didn't have anyone to follow. There was no guidance. There was no person, not even Uncle John Stott. There was no one to say, he has done it, so I'm going to follow in his plan. So every step of the way, I fell hard. Now, you might ask, how did you fall? Well, I received severe criticism from mostly my closest friends because they felt threatened. They felt threatened. What if, say, for example, what if the studies of Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam in some way tarnish the narratives of the Christian faith that they know? But once I tell them there is no single narrative that every tradition of the Christian faith shares, but as you rightly said in the discussion, there are core values. And outside the core values, each geographical location will add layers of cultural nuances. For example, when you go to Japan, among some of the Christians in the early days, you see that Mary looks very Japanese. You go to Ethiopia, Mary is absolutely dark-skinned. Things like that, right? Because every generation of people will try to put a layer to express who they are in the context of God. So in a sense, they project God in their image, surprisingly. So once I realized that, I began to do this sort of investigation with the confidence that if God is behind all human inquiry, which I strongly believe, meaning everything we know and that we can know is a gift of God's revelation, then I should have nothing to fear. The only fear I might have is my own ego. If I'm not prepared to admit failure in my investigation or to say I'm wrong in the past 20 or 30 years, then I am the one I should be worried about, not other people. I am the biggest challenge to myself.
You say your work is different from other research-based ministries in that you have a missional approach to it. How is that so?
Well, typically when you talk about, I'm going to mention academic and mission, the like and unlikes of each one, right? Like a traditional academic, I'm not driven by publication for the sake of career advancement or even the illusion that I have something strikingly new to say, as if God spoke to me last night in the phone call and now the whole world must know this new information God gave me. I don't have the kind of illusion. My task is to sift through the overwhelming amount of proclamations announced in the past 2,500 years, from the emergence of what we now call Judaism to today. There have been a lot of proclamations, and a lot of it we know. Some prophet says in Montana that the world will end tomorrow, October 23rd. And if it doesn't happen, they say, because I prayed and God held his hand, that sort of thing, right? I realized that in all these years' announcements, facts were not checked because it was not possible. So I'm using science, technology, and medicine to begin to check the facts. I'll give you one quick example. The invention of the camera in the 1830s in France led to eventually the rethinking of what history means. In the old days, history was his story. Whatever your story was, there's no way to verify. The camera put paid to that. If you do a study of the camera system, the moment you could take photographs, a lot of wild and woolly claims stopped, including mariners' claims that there are monsters in the sea with mermaids and mermaids. All that stopped because people ask questions. Show me a photograph. Now, I won't go into what happens with Photoshop. That's a different story, right? It could change everything. Now, like a traditional academic, I'm free to use any tool of inquiry at my disposal because I'm not hampered by denominational constraints or academic disciplinary boundaries that we also talked about, that all academies have certain agendas. This is because I've no career competitors. No professor is worried that I'm going to take the jobs, and I'm not incentivized by economic benefits or motivated by scholarly prestige, since I've long abandoned those securities for life as an independent, interdisciplinary investigator. Like a traditional missionary, I seek to understand cultures not my own and empathize with their existential questions about life, suffering, death, and God. But unlike a traditional missionary, I'm not sent by any ecclesiastical body, so I'm not under pressure to produce results measured by conversions or success at reaching unreached peoples. Now, these are legitimate issues that both traditional academics and traditional missionaries do. So let me affirm the very important roles that academics and missionaries in a traditional sense play in the kingdom of God. But in the past 30 years, I've carved out for myself the possibilities of a niche ministry in which I favor uninhibited quest over the social security of acceptance. And I've also worked out that at the end of the day, so much of a lot of what we do in ministry are colored by economics and peer pressure, which is very hard to listen to and hard for me to even say, because I still have many friends in the traditional academic world and ministry. And for them to come to realize that economics plays such a major role can be a bit disturbing. But I think in a radio program like this, we want to raise the level of consciousness and be adult about this, because the young people out there, they're aware of it. You need money to run any program, and there's nothing wrong with it. Now, what I've learned, to my surprise, was that the Buddhist world in the Silk Road, from the very early days, they realized the importance of economics, and they play a very major role, so that early Buddhism was very much involved in the business world, as was Islam. It's the Christian world that sort of in some way shy away from the business world, and we think somehow money is a terrible thing, but it has never been such a case. It's part of the blessing of God. So once I liberated myself from the reliance on what humans think and focus on God as my prime accountability, it was then up to my financial supporters to judge me and my ministry on his own merit, devoid of any association with trademark names or with stamps of approval, because in the old days, in the 70s, you had to belong to some international organization as an umbrella, a covering they call it, so that, there you are. So I'm taking the risk. My risk is this. Judge me on who I am. It's very public. Judge me on my work. Forget about names. And that's why I don't really mention the ministry's name that much. It's not very important. So to close, I want to say, it's a road not much travel, I can assure you. But by God's grace, I'm still in business, as it were. Partly because my focus on intellectual and spiritual integrity resonates with a new generation of believers who responded to my invitation to think through their faith.
We are talking to Dr. Ron Choong, founder and director of the Academy for Christian Thoughts. We're going to take a short break now. Please don't go away. We'll be right back.
Rhema Radio.
Hi, this is Gerald from Beat the System. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you, Lord, for this wonderful day, Lord. You have given me this opportunity to be right here, Lord. Lord, I pray, Lord, for those who are listening to this podcast, I pray that you will guide them, Lord, in whatever situation that they are in, Lord, good or bad. I pray that you will open ways for them, Lord, that you will come through and you will show them, Lord, how much you love them. Lord, I pray, Lord, that whoever that are in need in financial difficulties, in emotional, in physical difficulties, I pray, Lord, that you will heal them, you will open opportunities for them, you will just let the river of blessing just flow in their life, Lord. In Jesus Christ's name we ask and we pray. Amen.
Rhema Radio.
Hi, we're back. I'm Victor, and here in the studio we have Dr. Ron Choong. And we were just talking about how his work through Acts transcends various different disciplines, and it has a missiology approach. And I want to just ask you now, Dr. Ron, whether, despite the fact that you're independent and you have a policy of not being reliant on any one organization, whether or not you have any sort of impact on other types of mission that they could use to further the work that they do, possibly making it more effective on the ground.
Sure. Let me start by New York City itself. For many, many years, a lot of my lectures were actually done at the headquarters of the American Bible Society in Broadway, right in Manhattan. And the reason for that is that the vice presidents of the society knew of my work, and they also knew that in terms of Bible societies, it's very hard to get a scholar or a missionary to come together to express the need for a Bible in different places. So for many years now, we've had links to them, and all my lectures are there. We are also sponsored by another group called the Women's Bible Society of New York. They are one of the oldest Bible societies in America. They are currently sponsoring my upcoming book, which is a Christian guide to the Natural History Museum in New York. That museum talks about dinosaurs and all that. And they realize young people ask these questions and they say, why aren't dinosaurs in Noah's Ark? And all the embarrassing questions. Another book that they have sponsored is a book that's coming out end of the year, The Origin of the Bible, clearly because they are Bible. Now, both are conservative groups, so that's one set there. Up in near Yale University in Connecticut is a ministry called the Overseas Mission Study Center, where they sponsor missionaries on furlough from different countries to come. And I was invited to do a 4-day seminar on finding the fingerprints of God in nature. That's what they're interested in. Now, the recent one I did in February, they included the president of a seminary in Myanmar. They included missionaries in the Philippines, in Africa, in South Korea, and in Nigeria. So that's another element of the missions impact. Another one came through Luther Seminary, where I was the 2008 Burgess Lecturer. And that is a lectureship established some years ago for an international search every year for someone to talk about missions from a perspective of scholarship. So these are some examples of our connections. But Direct connections are, I have visited 29 of 53 African countries, and also in places like Ghana, Nigeria, and Angola. I'll be invited to speak to the people there about the latest developments in the sciences and how the missionaries there should be prepared to be aware of these sort of questions. So yes, there are these sort of links directly to the mission world.
You mentioned science, you mentioned archaeology in this little short talk that we have. But your main motivation is to look for evidence for the Christian faith, to find the fingerprints of God, like you say, in the different fields of our lives. Have you discovered anything over the last many years that you've been in these different fields that have encouraged you as a Christian to say to yourself that, I am a Christian because I believe the evidence. I have seen it, I have touched it, I've felt it, I've heard it?
Sure. Well, let me first intone and invoke the idea of legal scholarship. Those of you who are listening who are lawyers or law students will know that, in fact, the most important evidence in court is circumstantial evidence, not direct evidence, because direct evidence needs interpretation and you can interpret so many things out of context. Circumstantial evidence is where most of the battles are fought and won, because circumstantial evidence needs more than one source. It needs multiple sources to radar in, like the prospects of a GPS, to find out, to make sure the wiggle room is less. So I'm going to mention the list that you gave me. In astronomy, I realized the scope and scale of creation, and am humbled by our petty quarrels. When you watch a movie like Gravity, Inception, for example, and The Brain, and all these other great movies, I'm a great movie fan, by the way, and you find out in space, you look at the vastness of God's creation, and you realize what a stupid race we are, killing each other and fighting each other, pretending that we are the universe. We are not the universe. We are a tiny speck. But I marvel at the greatness of God's creation, and that transformed a lot of my thinking about what are the limits of God's creation. In science, technology, and medicine, I see the guiding hand of God in evolution and better understand collateral damage in theodicy. Now, that's a very technical term, so let me quickly unpack it. I use, in many quarters, a dirty word, evolution. Evolution simply means change over time. That's all it's ever meant. But we have used the word as a battleground for so many things, and we confuse ourselves in what it means. What we see in science, the discovery of science, technological innovation, and medical advances. Clearly, the way God created the universe and us was that we are part of this ever-evolving, ever-knowing, and ever-thinking part of who we are. You might imagine, if you have a loved one who died of a particular disease years ago, why didn't God give us the cure then? Why now? These are questions that are very heart-rending to answer, but they are there. Why didn't God make it such a way that all of us have inceptions of memory, so you don't need missionaries? Everyone knows the gospel from day one and we're saved. It's a shortcut, right? I can't answer why God didn't do it, but I can tell you that's what God did. So we can deal with only what happened. We can't deal with second-guessing God in that context. In archaeology, I'm optimistic about the prospects of a deeper enlightenment of pre- and post-biblical emergence, simply meaning this. The Bible came at a particular place in time, in a very short space in time, actually, about 2,500 years ago. But humans have been around a lot longer than that, which means our expression of knowing God is best understood in artifacts that goes back 100,000 years rather than a book written 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, because these writings were premised on earlier understandings of God that we find in art, for example, 100,000 years in South Africa. So I do a lot of these discovery ideas. And let me just say, in all the cave art we find, from Sulawesi in 2012 all the way to the caves of Spain and France, every serious scholar accepts that the primary motivation was religion. It wasn't art for art's sake. It's dark in the cave. It's hard to get there. It's not to show off how great the art is. It's an attempt to reach the unknown post-death. In origins research, I became aware of how God's creation worked. In paleoanthropology, I see that under the skin, we are all creatures loved by God. Take away the skin and the flesh. You look at a skull, you can't tell the race of a person. When you take a skeleton, apart from certain parts of the pelvis, you can't tell whether it's male or female. You take two skulls of a gorilla, a monkey, and a human, it takes a specialist to tell the difference on the dentition. Very jarring information, but that's what your kids will learn in college. What I'm telling you, for those who are listening, you have kids in college, it's not new. It's been around a long time. It's just that we never had an opportunity as theologians to engage at this level in these sort of disciplines. And finally, I want to say the area that I'm most interested in, because it best expresses Jesus' compassion for the weakest among us, is neuroscience, the study of the human brain. Because I learned to appreciate God's compassion for the weakest and voiceless among us. There's nothing more lonely than to have a mental illness, because no one can see your injury. And for years, we distance ourselves from those because they seem unlovely to us. And I'm hoping that in my work on neuroscience for the church, we will begin to see that among those who are the most lonely and the most despised in the world, those are the ones that gravitate to Jesus because Jesus welcomes them. So that's the summary of some of the work that I do.
Wow. You cover the whole ambit of science and history.
No, not exactly the whole ambit.
In 20 minutes, it's not going to be easy to try and capture all of that. But I suppose if I could summarize your life's journey or your life's work, it's really to for yourself at least, to understand things, and you be the first to admit that you are not infallible.
Oh, absolutely.
That you are still on a journey of discovery. But the things that you find through your research work has led you to certain, could you say, conclusions? Or is it would you say it's a path that you lead that leads you down to maybe a different way of thinking about life?
I think one way to think about that question is, and people ask me a lot, has that made you somehow an outlier in the Christian world? How are you different? Well, let me start by saying I have no illusions about discovering the Christian faith. But my primary goal is to clear my mind of certain theological cobwebs that encrusted over the years because of nationalism, tribalism, sexism, all the things that we think are culture. They color our view, and sometimes they sort of obstruct us from understanding God, who sees us first and foremost as humans, not as Malaysians or Chinese or male or female. And Paul talks about that, right, in Galatians. In God's eyes, we are equal. We are not Greek or Hebrew. We are not. Now, all these stuff influence a lot of my work. So my goal is not so much to, in my lifetime, find the definitive expression of God to the human mind, but my goal is, if I can remove the bulk of the cobwebs so that I can invite the light of God's revelation to shine through our minds, and we think beyond the constraints of tribalism and my church and my denomination and even my religion, for that matter. If we can get to that point, we can really glorify God in the way we talk about. So that's the reality I live with. I do not expect to finish my work in my lifetime. That is very staggering for an academic, because we all like to think that before we die, we'll write the book. There is no the book to write. We have lived and died in the 2,000 years of Christianity where no one before us have had information we have today. And that's a shocking thing, right? So let me give you one example of how archaeology and the jet engine changed the lives of many people. 2009, I was in Turkey. There was an earthquake, and earthquakes are when we rush in because it's a freebie. The earth removes stuff up and we can see things. And I was with a professor of New Testament, Eugene Boring from Texas, and he's an evangelical. He was so dominant in New Testament commentaries, and he wrote one specifically, a book of Revelation. He was 82 or 83. And I was talking with him, having lunch. We were together for 16 days. And I said, Dr. Eugene Boring, you must have been here countless of times. And he said, oh no, Ron, this is my first time in Turkey. I said, first time? How is it possible? You have written so much on this. And he said, young man, I was 49 at the time, and he was 82. He said, young man, when I was anywhere near your age, we couldn't come here safely. Jet engines were dangerous, and when we got here, we didn't know where to stay. We didn't have NASA satellites to help us do ground probing work. This was 2009. At that moment, it sort of shocked me that what I took for granted, access to jet planes and all kinds of machines to measure, it wasn't available within living memory. So that's one example of how, if you take seriously God's gift to the human mind of all the access to tools, we try so hard to cure ourselves of cancer and heart disease and all that with all the instrumentation we have. But for some strange reason, the church, and I say the church including me, I'm part of the church, we seem to be a bit intellectually lazy about understanding God and the Bible and the artifacts and the history of the church. For some reason, we never invest in this. And I challenge you, listeners, to check your church budget everywhere you go. How much of the budget is actually spent on research? And it'll be very, very shocking. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Some of our listeners may listen to what you have said over the last 15 to 20 minutes and take issues with it, because
Sure.
we've all been taught to, or at least within our own convictions, we've had a certain way of looking at
The certain lens,
through a certain lens,
Sure. And it's your role to be their voice. I get it.
Yeah, but I'm reminded of what the Bible tells us, that the greatest commandment is to love our God with all our heart, our soul, our strength,
mind,
and our minds. Yeah. So I suppose you bring some of that into our discussion, and I think it's something worth thinking about. Now, if someone wants to know more about your ministry and the work that you do, you talk about education, you talked about the research work you've done through books, you've got podcasts and YouTube videos as well. Can you give us a bit more direction? What should they look for as a starter?
As a starter, we have our website, www.actministries, one word, .org. So that's the standard format of people looking through it. For those of you who are more academically inclined or you want to read more, I've also published a bit on medium.com. And finally, for those who are social media savvy, you just type my name and go on Facebook. It's an open Facebook. You can follow a lot of my trips and discussions and reflections. But bear in mind, they were not written for the church. They were written as an outreach. So a lot of my postings on Facebook are read by faculty members from different fields, from different countries. And sometimes you'll find some strident engagement, some challenges, mostly from atheists. And then you'll find some Christians coming in and defending me. And I always tell them, no, I want their voice. I want to hear what they want to say. I want to see whether some of the questions they have of me may be legitimate. And I need to change, or I need to correct or clarify. So when you go to the Facebook page, there are 2 Facebook accounts with Ron Choong. They're both me. This was before Facebook clamped down and said, you have only one. If there's one with me eating a naan bread with a hat, that's the one, don't bother about that. That's a decoy one when I go to countries that may question my presence as a Christian missionary.
That's the one you give them.
That's the one I give them. Because every driver says, sir, can I have your Facebook account? Doesn't matter. I'll go to the Sudan in the desert and they do this. The other one is the one of a cartoon of the Rodin's thinker. And next to it is an empty platform called The Doer. So that's a funny cartoon because I want to tell them that thinking is nice, but do something about your thinking. So that's the one you can go for in the Facebook. But my suggestion is that when you go on my Facebook, it's an open Facebook, try not to use angry words or disarm anyone on this, because it's supposed to be an invitation, a safe space to ask questions about God, and not a place to propagate your personal beliefs by confronting other people.
Doctor, it's been really fascinating listening to you. I come away from this interview with more questions than I could think possible, but it's been enlightening, certainly. And for our listeners, we always bear in mind that the wisdom of man is foolishness to God, but we have a responsibility to understand the world that God has given us, because it is through our understanding that we are probably going to be more effective in reaching others for Christ. So once again, thank you very much, Dr. Ron, for your time here. We look forward to being able to see you again in the future, perhaps maybe even to come back and talk to us about an area that I'm particularly interested in, and that is archaeology. There's so much of our history that we don't know. And you do the digging and you do all that Indiana Jones stuff. That, I think that would be fascinating if you could come back and listen and enlighten us about your trips.
Absolutely. And let me do one thing more staggering. I could do a Skype interview while I'm there.
That would be wonderful.
Wouldn't you like to
we
have
could
me
beam
talk
that
to
live
you
into the homes of our listeners.
Yeah, when I'm in Iraq and I'm in Nineveh or Baghdad and I'm walking through the land that very likely Abraham was from and crossed the Euphrates River, and I can say, Victor, I'm now crossing the Euphrates River. Pray for me as I try to get across this raging river in the footsteps of Abraham.
That would be wonderful. Thank you very much, Doctor. You've been listening to Rhema Radio. We've enjoyed having you listen to us, and we've enjoyed the company of Dr. Ron Choong. Till next time, God bless.
的作为何等奇妙。我要欢喜快乐唱新歌，掏出欢喜使我心欢畅，把烦恼重担卸给你。抬头仰望你的慈爱，情是存到永远。你铺张云彩当我们的遮盖，我的帮助从你而来，保护我不致摇动，我出我入你都保护我。每个早晨我都要赞美，每个夜晚我都要呈现，主你的作为何等奇妙。我要欢喜快乐唱新歌，掏出欢喜使我心欢畅，把烦恼重担卸给你。抬头仰望你的慈爱，情是存到永远。你铺张云彩当我们的遮盖，我的帮助从你而来，保护我不致摇动，我出我入你都保护我。抬头仰望你的慈爱，情是存到永远。你铺张云彩当我们的遮盖，我的帮助从你而来，保护我不致摇动，我出我入你都保护我，从今世直到永远。
This segment features music from Carmen Sarah Choong. This episode was edited, mixed and recorded by Moses Chen at Prodio Studio. Do connect with us at facebook.com/rhemarad.10. Comment, like and share our weekly shows so we can do more. Tune in next week for the next midweek service and interview. Till then, God bless.
I found it on Rhema Radio.